So it's still a practice to present the paper binders?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Still to this day. And the O&M manuals are about 5,000 pages apiece.
Welcome to the real world, Sasha.
These are true stories
of the shared pains
facing designers,
builders,
inspectors,
and operators
on a quest to streamline collaboration
in the digital age. Find out what happens
when industry and technology
stop playing nice
and start getting real.
We
are the Construction Progress Coalition. And this is the Shared Pains Podcast. Welcome to the Construction Shared Pains Podcast. My name is Sasha Reed, and as your host, my role is to help all of us gain a new perspective on the systemic changes that are needed for design and construction to thrive in the digital age. Our final CDX challenge was transforming the as-built handover, presented by InEight. Here to break down the shared pains with defining, producing, and validating as-built document standards is CPC's Thought Leadership Chair, Dan Smamillo.
I can remember as a project engineer, a typical nightmare that would come along with as-builts, the process of what are we actually delivering to the owner, what are the requirements and the specifications versus what do they truly want as that turnover package at the end of the project. I remember one project, there was the horror story, the specification actually called for a drafter to be hired and brought onto the project to hand draft some of the changes that occurred through the life cycle of that project. There's so much opportunity to improve the as-built process through virtual coordination, digital handoffs, and reality capture from the field. It's clear that paper-based handover process is inefficient, outdated, and wasteful, but it's often still a part of the handover requirement. And that's not to begin with the waste and the inefficiencies in the digital process. This dual requirement is a great example of the $15.8 billion in waste generated out of these redundant workflows.
The process is fairly simple. Digest, debate, decide, and deliver. First, we'll digest the root causes of unreliable as-builts in order to debate which project stakeholders have the most incentive and influence to replace analog documentation standards with digital performance requirements. Hearing from these different perspectives, remember, the role is yours to decide which of these innovations applies to your situation and where to begin. Now, let's bring in our roving reporter, Nathan Wood, to introduce our guest perspectives and kick off the discussion.
Thanks, Sasha. To help us better understand our shared pains related to the as-built exchange, I caught up with a good friend of ours who first convinced me that a PDF could technically pass the definition of BIM as long as it's a smart PDF. Allow me to introduce Alan Engel of
JLL, Jones Lang LaSalle, so that we don't have any more acronyms. BDC, FM Integration Manager. So I act almost like a owner's rep to kind of bridge that gap between the owner and their concept ideas or needs around BIM and or most importantly, metadata around that. Back between the architects and contractors so that we can create kind of that supply chain of data that we need created and shared throughout the process to reduce the shared pains that we're discussing.
Representing the design perspective on this episode, I asked Alan what he considers to be as-built in the digital age. I
teach my owners as-built is a Navisworks model. And that does them no good at the end of a project. They're more interested in that file that they can author changes to, especially when they're talking about maintaining space or, maintaining a model that they can, add or move things around in. And, what we have to begin to then just figure out is how do we get that design intent model to be that as-built model at the end of the project?
Our next perspective has participated in his fair share of BIM standards kickoff meetings with owners, especially on the government side. Meet
Connor Christian. I am the Director of Product Services at InEight for InEight's Model Suite product. I've worked mostly in construction throughout my career, working for a number of companies, Walsh Construction, West Builders, McCarthy, and Kiewit. Half of that role was out there working in the field as project engineer and superintendent, and the other half of it has been focused on the technology side, helping contractors solve their problems using BIM. But I've also had the opportunity to work with many owners in trying to figure out how to use BIM for facility management. I was lucky enough to continue working with other owners, including the U.S. Department of State, the VA, the FHWA.
So it should come as no surprise that Connor is now chairman of CPC's Standards Review Committee, but you might be surprised to learn that the source of Connor's as-built shared panes came from his days as a superintendent.
Yeah, well, I'll say you haven't really, lived until you've closed out a job in construction, particularly in the days where it was all paper. That would take months, to close out a hospital job. It would take 6 months of just talking with subcontractors and gathering all sorts of information and putting it in binders and making sure that all of your drawings are up to date. And you always had to have your clean set. That is a set of drawings that you haven't messed up very much, but are still representative of the final state, and have all your red lines on there. And trying to take all of that and put it together to hand off to someone, knowing full well that they have nowhere to keep it and that they're probably just going to throw it in a room. And that was how they were doing it when I was a superintendent.
So it's still a practice to present the paper binders?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Still to this day. And not even single sets, like duplicate sets. The last project I was on 3 years ago, 7 copies of the O&M manuals. And the O&M manuals were about 5,000 pages apiece.
Welcome to the real world, Sasha.
Another gentleman who's lived firsthand the slow and steady evolution of changing as-built handover standards in construction is
Todd Sutton, Zachry Corporation. And I've been with Zachry for 29 years and in the construction industry for 30 years. With Zachry, I've worked on everything from process plants, power plants, and more recently the vertical building and implementing the BIM and facilitating project handover for the projects. And then within our and currently I'm working on the horizontal construction for highways and bridges.
After my breakfast conversation with Todd during Bluebeam XCon, I strolled on up to the InEight booth to find
Mike Boyle. I'm the product manager for the model suite. The model suite is focused on, naturally, models, 3D models, whereas the project suite is more focused on project control applications. So we're talking about time card systems, project planning, controls for budget control, as well as some inspection and some things like that.
Basically all the tasks that Todd needs to do as a project controls manager. Rounding out our industry perspective on this episode is
Darren Roos. I am the BIM VDC director for a general contractor called Bernard's. We're based in Southern California, do work in Los Angeles and Central California area. A lot of different types of work down there. I started my career in manufacturing, did that for 8 years, did a lot of lean manufacturing and trying to pull waste out of that process, and seeing all the waste that was in the construction industry made me kind of transition over there to see if we could use that technology to help in construction.
As we debate the compounding challenges with transforming a traditional process like as-built, Mike shared a common pain point that he sees a lot from his perspective.
With all respect to the designers that are out there, but a lot of times we get garbage data in our models, and
it's not their fault always.
It is not always
but it is a result.
That's
it
why
happens.
I say with all respect, because there's a lot of things at play: the way they design them, the way they create them, the software that they use, the process they go through,
their motivations,
the departments, all those sorts of things play into this. And there's a lot of things that can and are being worked out in that realm.
On the flip side, Todd explains how a stringent owner requirement that isn't actually understood by the owner can wreak even more havoc.
Take for example, like a BIM deliverable project, and the owner requires that LOD 500, but the architect's only required to supply LOD 300. for their portion of the work. And so the trades actually bring in and their portion at the LOD 500, which is as built, but that's where the specification ends, because they boilerplate the specifications, and then they don't give you any detail exactly how do they want that, what views do they want, the details of how to hand it over. So you're trying to guess at what they want, and then you hand it over and then it's not what they want, so you try to redo it. So
And I guess another option might be we'll just give them everything, right? But
Right.
Does that not solve the problem?
No, it's kind of like throwing spaghetti on the wall and seeing what sticks, and that's not a good way of doing it.
So why should an owner care about an integrated, as-built, deliverable handover? Alan explains.
They need something that, if a certain asset says it's in 301, that asset needs to be in there. Not that it was in there during the design intent, and then during construction it got moved into 302. We need to know what that is. And the same thing happens on the other side. The owner's going to have to keep up with it, because I have plenty of owners that don't do a great job at that. And an operation guy goes out to room 301 for that asset, and it's now in 302 because they haven't maintained their system as well either.
The solution to our as-built dilemma resides at the intersection of realistic standards with realistic enforcement protocols. With his wealth of industry standards knowledge, Connor clued me into a not-so-hidden dilemma produced out of the latest version of our national CAD standards.
One thing you're going to be delivering is not only the PDFs of those drawings, but you need to deliver DWGs or DGNs as well. And that those DWGs and DGNs need to match the drawings as well as match national CAD standards. The only problem is that most of us out there, particularly designers, are not creating their drawings in CAD anymore. They're creating them from models. And you can't meet national CAD standards when creating your drawings from models. That's just a fact. You can't create the right symbols. You can't create the right line weights. And we're actually, every company struggles with the fact that what they're doing is creating their drawings from a model, exporting them to a CAD software, and then redrawing them again in order to meet those CAD standards that only exist because of government legacy systems.
What a great example of trying to force new technology to work within legacy systems. As we look for strategies to address these challenges, Darren gives us a real-world shared pain and how he dealt with it. I'll give you a hint. It has to do with communication.
Yeah, one of the projects we talked about is a prison project that we're doing in Central California. And it's one where the owner reached out to a consultant to help write their BIM spec. And of course, the consultant told them, you need all of this as your BIM deliverable. And when they showed that to us, it's stuff that we can do, but it's expensive. And we wanted to meet with them and say, we can do all this, but does it make sense? And is this information that you're really going to need? And there's other information that we could give them that wasn't in the spec. And so we kind of actually had a meeting with them, brought the owner, brought the facility people together, the designer, talked about the spec, talked about the future maintenance of the building, and kind of came up with a compromise of what we were going to give them at the end.
So for as-builts to become more reliable and efficient in the digital age, we need standards that create mutual benefit between project stakeholders. Mike reiterates for us what can happen when an owner tries to slip new boilerplate requirements into traditional contracts.
Typically what would happen is the contractor would say, great, add more money to my contract and I'll do that for you. Now, the thing that we're trying to create is an efficiency within the industry. So not only is this process good for the owner, but it's also good for the contractor. And combined, they can both take advantage of this one process that collects information in an organized way, and it passes it from one process, one stage of the game to the next. And so the contractor should see efficiencies in his own processes, and the owner should see efficiencies in his process. And so that pass-through is what we need to get people to realize, is that this is best for both of us, not I ask you to do it and you pay me for it.
And Mike is absolutely correct that exponential value comes from the adoption of integration standards between each project stakeholder. But the problem, as Alan describes, has less to do with the standard itself and more to do with the language we use to define it.
what we're seeing in the industry is many people call many things different things. It could be a VAV, it could be a fan terminal unit, it could be a fan coil, and just along that name within itself, then, how do you standardize data that you put into a model that can be moved downstream? And then secondly, how do you mandate a portfolio standard around that as well? Because one thing we have to really understand is an owner is looking at this not as a project, but as a portfolio. So whatever asset that we may have in that model that moves downstream and eventually into their system has to relate back to a portfolio, not just that project in hand. And that's hard for a lot of us because a lot of us are really project based, and that's what we're doing. So what we're trying to do is get those owners to say, okay, what are those standards so that we can normalize that data up front and give that design team direction when they put assets into the model, that they just don't name them based on whatever that design team is used to naming them, and it doesn't work for the owner. Name them so that that owner can see that name right then and there, and that data will eventually move to the construction team. He'll add additional data to it, and then once again, seamlessly, it's just flowing downstream into operations based on that.
Todd brings both the perspective of an EPC, engineer, procure, construct contractor, as well as an AEC contractor, where he's generally required to collaborate with a separate architect and engineering firm. I wanted to better understand how the as-built exchange differs between these two project types.
The biggest part on the EPC side is, well, I guess the good thing is you're not dealing with architects, but
we can't say that on the podcast.
Well, you can have to edit that one out.
but that's true, and that's actually how I often explain, is that because you're not dealing with the need for architecture and thought of how people use the space, because it's not necessarily for people's use of space.
Functional,
it's functional first,
right?
Aesthetics second,
exactly,
and that's what makes
no aesthetics at all.
Exactly. It's purely functionally driven, and that's what makes AEC so challenging, because you have the aesthetic architecture, but then you have the engineering that has to support it,
right.
and then the constructability as well. So those three components, it's almost that Mexican standoff.
Right.
Whereas in EPC, you kind of you get to bowl everything over because there's only one driver of functionality, cost, schedule.
Another key difference between EPC and AEC is the contract risk. Generally, EPC projects have a single contractor to manage the risk of both the design and construction, which is also known as CM at risk. When AEC projects try to implement progressive data exchange standards under a traditional incentive like design, bid, build contracts, stakeholders may begin to do silly things like,
this was my first project where the architect actually charged us for the model.
Ooh.
And
charged the GC.
Yeah. So they wanted $10,000 for the model. It was something that we could have remodeled ourselves for $5,000. But there was a part in the spec that said you must use the architect's model, and the architect said you must pay us this much money. I mean, in defense of the architect, I'm sure there's plenty of architects that get frustrated that they're the ones who spend so much time creating this model to begin with, and then they're expected to give it to the contractor for free. So depending on how their contract is written, how they're getting paid, it's I guess it makes sense for us. Our frustration was that we feel like by them sharing their model information, we're able to help them in the long run, because now we're going to avoid all of that RFI and issue time later on in the project if we can use their model to actually be proactive to the coordination of the project.
While Darren's example may be extreme, it's a microcosm of the dilemma most BIM and VDC professionals face in one way or another when trying to overcome adversarial contract incentives with collaborative technology solutions. It's like oil and water. But every once in a while, at the intersection of top-down standards and bottom-up innovation, lies the Tappan Zee Bridge project, which Connor worked on during his time at HDR. If you thought your BIM deliverable standards were bad,
literally asked for a database tied to an as-built model, basically, and that it was connecting all of the documentation. That was that vague. It said, it wants a database, it wants a 3D model, and wants all the documentation tied. And arguably, 8 years ago, nothing really existed that would help you do that.
But just as time would have it, InEight shows up with a new tool they've been developing called MDO, or
model data operations.
Model data operation. Okay.
Those are essentially automated processes that use the parametrics of the model. So the way I like to explain it is it squeezes every last drop of value out of that model you receive from your designer. So nothing gets left on the cutting room floor. In our case, we actually take that information, we extract every last piece we can out of it using these data operations, and we turn it into something greater than its constituent parts.
We were actually using InEight's Model Suite product to automate the connection between object and the documents that it was supposed to connect to.
Before Connor delivers one of the more ridiculous ROI metrics I've heard on the value of integrated BIM for as-built, I first had him describe for us how they got to the calculated time savings.
The typical workflow would be click on an element, go find the document and select it. Say, this is the document that applies to this element. There's probably some easier ways to speed that up, but that's generally the workflow. And what we figured is if we had one person working full time, making one connection every minute and connecting an element to a document every minute, that it would have taken them well over 11 years to actually make all the connections.
Wow, 11 man years. Based on an average BIM engineer's salary, that's almost $1 million in direct project savings. But I've set up enough workflow automations to know that they're certainly not foolproof, and they don't just happen overnight.
It took us about 2 weeks of kind of setting it up so that everything was functioning right with the way that those kind of little automated codes were working. But once the setup was done, we could make millions of connections, distinct elements to their distinct documentation, and we could do all of the connections, in the span of a couple hours. And the way the software is going to soon be down to a couple minutes.
Okay, great. But what happens when the owner changes their mind right before handover? Like that's never happened before.
People like their data in a certain way. We actually had gotten it all set up in one way, only to bring it to the client and then have them say, we'd like it structured a different way. Luckily, we had a tool that meant we could make that change in a day, not in years.
At the end of the day, it always comes back to establishing that common language for the project team. In the Tappan Zee Bridge example, it came down to
every single element needs to understand at the very least what it is and where it is. And we're able to define that with 6 parameters that every single model element had. And we made sure to define that before the model started being created, so that the modelers were adding that information on as they modeled. And asking them to get 6 parameters on what are you and where are you is still very difficult, at least in today's workflows.
This difficulty should be no surprise after hearing Darren's challenges with freely accessing the designer's data, no pun intended. I had to understand from Connor, though, how the Tappan Zee Bridge project was contracted in that case.
It was a target price contract model, and it was a joint venture that actually was working on the project. And what that meant was that they did all share in the risk. It's something that I think is done in the transportation industry that maybe isn't done in the building industry, the way that they contract this kind of project. And it's fairly close to IPD in the way that there is risk sharing. And so there was a significant risk to the contractor and to HDR if this was not produced correctly.
After closer inspection, it appears the Tappan Zee Bridge case study, which, by the way, is linked in our show notes, was truly a perfect storm of digital as-built requirements, shared risk and reward contracts, and the use of technology to integrate and translate data standards. Too often, the authority-having jurisdiction, or AHJ, is treated as a needless, waste-generating gatekeeper. But in reality, the governing organizations serve a crucial role in the quality, safety, and security of our built environment. But only when we all recognize their role as yet another project stakeholder along the project's informational supply chain, and not the headmaster of the project. Thankfully, Connor had nothing but good things to say about his AHJ.
And I have to say kudos to NISTA for, 1, putting it in there, and then 2, sticking to it. Because so many times we've seen when people don't understand something they're supposed to deliver, that they just remove it.
But more often than not, we are faced with the uphill battle of educating our owners of the importance of their ability to communicate the data standards that they actually care about.
So what we're trying to do is get those owners to say, okay, what are those standards so that we can normalize that data up front and give that design team direction when they put assets into the model, that they just don't name them based on whatever that design team is used to naming them, and it doesn't work for the owner. Name them so that that owner can see that name right then and there, and that data will eventually move to the construction team. He'll add additional data to it, and then once again, seamlessly, it's just flowing downstream into operations based on that.
So what do we do when faced with an owner who is overly excited about the potential for a BIM as-built handover? Alan gives his owners
2 mantras. One is BIM driven, not BIM dependent. This may or may not have a huge impact on BIM once it gets into construction and or into operations, because a lot of that has to do with asset management. And that's where my owners are really seeing the value, is to start looking at it like that, opposed to thinking this model that we keep getting hung up on so many times is going to be the end all, correct all for all the problems we have. And the second one is speaking a common language. That owner has to explain to the design team how they want information developed so that it can move fluidly downstream, so the construction team can add additional data to that, and then eventually have that data pulled, however it moves, into the operation side.
Rather than inserting boilerplate BIM standards into traditional contract language, owners need to recognize and communicate which aspects of BIM data they care about, and more importantly, which aspects they don't care about or are unwilling to pay for.
So we've had to create some creative ways in which we hire the design team back to update the design intent models that we got at, right before construction, to make them adjust and equal, what that Navisworks model looks like of what was actually built. And that doesn't mean we have to increase the level of detail to 400 or anything that you may see in the Navisworks model. It just means I need things located where they actually ended up being built.
So once again, the conversation comes back to a common language and reliable trust in the data. After talking with Todd, I think there's a great opportunity moving forward for CBC to partner with
CII is the Construction Industry Institute. Zachry was was one of the founding members of CII, as well as FIATech, which was a separate organization that's now integrated back into. So inside the FIATech sector, I actually participate on a standing committee called Horizon 360. We have a matrix on that as well. It's called a technology scan matrix, looking across the multiple industries at how they're leveraging not just technology, but different processes, and how can we leverage that to bring up our productivity within construction, because there's a correlation between productivity and process improvement and technology implementation in the other industries like healthcare, manufacturing, for example. And we're at a turning point at this point where we're able to pivot and increase our productivity with the use of the technology and processes that we are currently implementing.
If you ask me, combining CII's reputation and legacy data sets with CPC's agile approach to integration standards development could be the perfect storm to help this industry re-baseline how we measure the cost, quality, and efficiency of as-built deliverables.
The city of Brisbane, Australia, they're in the beginning stages of defining these things. I feel like this is what they need.
Yeah.
Like they can do it as the city. They have the incentive. They have everything. Like this is something at their scope that I feel like they could do. If I just look at it from our level, I feel like we'd have to go back and get AIA to get on board, Building Smart. Like we'd have to get all these other organizations to.
Well, and that's
they don't have to change what they do, but they just have to,
And as an enabler, all we have to do is find those that want to do it and make sure that all the players that are impacted, are incentivized. And so we can go tell that story in Australia and bring that story back to the US. Darren was a great example of
being able to have that conversation that, yes, there's a barrier that says, the contract has this requirement, it's kind of outdated, it doesn't make sense. But if you have that conversation and you use, logic and reasoning and a case that makes sense to that CM or that owner, you can usually get them to, either change those rules or modify to make it easier so that we're not doing paper and digital. But if we don't know and we don't see, and then it's way too late and, we're staying up till midnight or later, putting 3-ring binders together. Dan's getting, red in the face over there just thinking about it. It's how we get away from that is by knowing that if that's going to happen, it's better to have that uncomfortable conversation in the beginning than it is to let it all fall on everyone's lap at the end.
CPC wishes to thank InEight and the Model Suite team for sponsoring the CDX Innovation Challenge, Transforming the As-Built Handover. As always, we appreciate the insights and wisdom from each of our guest perspectives and wish them the best as they fight the good fight. In our final episode of Season 1, we'll stop and reflect back on these shared pains and the initiatives born from the discussions. To learn more about 2019 membership and CDX initiatives, head to constructionprogress.org/membership for more information. Thank you for listening to episode 5 of the Construction Shared Pains podcast. We look forward to joining you here next time.